everyone, and thank you for tuning in to my podcast on Assessment for Learning. My name is Meredith Thomas, and I will discuss unlearning old beliefs about assessment in today's podcast. What is assessment for learning? For educators to understand what assessment for learning is and why we might use it, we're going to consider 3 questions. Educators can return to these questions again and again throughout their teaching in a lesson or unit. The first question is, where is the learner going? In other words, what is it educators want their students to know, do, or understand? The why of the learning. If the teachers share this goal with the students, everyone benefits from seeing a clear target. After teachers and learners know where the students are going, we are ready for the second question. The second question is, where is the learner now? How close are they to reaching the learning targets? Educators need to find the answer to this question regularly by regularly assessing where the learners are. Teachers can find out what students have accomplished, what they can do, and what they're still struggling with. Better yet, asking students to reflect on their own understanding against the learning targets and success criteria, they can contemplate their own progress and start to think about whether they have met the learning goals. Allowing students to engage in this practice gives them ownership in their learning and can develop reflective skills. The third question is, how can the learner get there? What could the teacher or the students do to help them get closer to the learning targets? These 3 questions give teachers evidence of their students' learning and help them to make informed instructional choices and be responsive to their learners' needs. If educators think about where the students are going, where they are now, and the activities to help their students achieve their learning objectives, they can provide students with mastery-oriented feedback, relevant materials, and the best learning path for each student. These 3 questions are an ongoing cycle throughout every lesson. So assessment for learning is an integrated teaching approach that elicits information about where the learners are in their learning so that teachers and students can provide feedback that continues to move learning forward. Most impactful assessment practices are those that engage students in metacognition. Self-assessment and reflection promotes a metacognitive approach in students. Self-assessment is necessary for a student's independent, successful learning. Helping students achieve success with self-assessment requires that educators focus on moving from the assessment done to the students and for the students to assessment done with and by the students. When educators write, select, or co-construct a rubric with students, the first 2 questions are, what are the criteria for satisfactory work on the task the rubric is assessing? And what should a student, peer, or teacher be looking for? One of the most valuable aspects of using rubrics is that these qualities are named and described. They become the targets students will aim for. To be useful and effective for rubrics, the criteria teachers and students choose must be definable and observable. They should also be different from one another so that students can evaluate them separately. Yet when taken together, the criteria define a set of characteristics that thoroughly describe a performance matching the description of learning in the standard or instructional goal. How can educators use assessment to help students learn better and take responsibility for their learning? When educators incorporate metacognitive practices in their assessments and include formative assessment as part of the learning process, students can develop dispositions and habits that lead to lifelong learning. They learn self-awareness, self-regulation, self-management, and responsible decision-making by practicing reflection regularly. To support students in this work, teachers need to unlearn some long-held beliefs about assessment. First, teachers must unlearn the belief that the teacher is the judge and jury when it comes to assessment. When students present educators with a final product for evaluation, educators, in the role of the judge, rob their students of the opportunity to reflect on their learning. When the teacher acts as the jury, the teacher and the student assume the teacher is the sole authority on the student's learning. The teacher as judge model is also backwards looking, offering post-mortem feedback less likely to lead to lifelong learning. Second, teachers must let go of the idea that every assessment must come with a grade. Research shows that students will disengage as soon as they see a grade on their work. Educators should instead consider giving feedback instead of grades on short-term assessments. Better still, allow the students' peers to provide the feedback. Third, assessment for learning is forward-looking. Its purpose is to take students from where they are to where they need to be. Thus, educators must unlearn the idea that assessment exists for the teacher's benefit. Instead of using evaluation to look back at what students did, teachers should use it to help students see where they are compared to where they are going. Just as educators adapt to effective assessment for learning approach in the classroom, students must unlearn some beliefs about assessment as well. First, students keeping the learning targets in mind can reframe their feedback as part of the learning process. Instead of viewing feedback as closure that comes at the end of the lesson, students can imagine the feedback as mile markers or checkpoints along the learning path. Second, students must unlearn the belief that teachers are responsible for student learning. When students accept that they can be reflective and adapt to obstacles along their learning journeys, they learn critical metacognitive skills that set them up for ongoing success in any endeavor. Students must learn to be forward-thinking, consider the criteria in assessment rubrics, and apply any changes leading to their success, whether those changes result from the teacher's suggestions or self-made observations. Finally, students must unlearn the notion that learning occurs in a vacuum. Learning is a social construct, and keen observers look for ways to apply classroom practice into everyday life. By observing how the lessons students learn in school apply to them in the real world, students can expand their worldview and have more context when working toward learning targets in the classroom. In today's episode, I discussed what assessment for learning is, how assessment helps students hit their learning goals, and what beliefs about assessment students and teachers need to unlearn for ongoing feedback and assessment for learning to be effective. Now it's your turn to reflect based on what we've discussed in this podcast. Think about your own teaching practices. I want you to think about what you already do. What more could you do? What tweaks could you make to your practice? How could you clarify where your learners are going? How could you find out where your learners are? And how could you respond to the information you receive about your students' learning?